Free Thursday night at the Walker Art Center. My name is Sarah Peters. I am the Public Programs Manager here at the Walker, and I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. It's really exciting to see a full house. Tonight's lecture is the second in a four-part series called Contemporary Art and Conversation, where we invite artists to come speak with an individual of their choice in a dialogue. And one of the goals behind this model is to allow artists to connect with thinkers whose work is of interest to them, but with whom they might not have a previous relationship. And this was our intention tonight, and with all good intentions, sometimes it doesn't work out as planned. Writer and critic Hilton Alls was scheduled to be a part of this program tonight, but unfortunately he can't be here. Luckily, in his place, we are able to host the brief return of former Walker curator Philippe Vergne, who is taking a break from his current post as co-curator of the 2006 Whitney Biennial to be here tonight. So a special thank you to Philippe for stepping up to the plate in the 11th hour. Those of you who are familiar with Kara Walker's silhouette work know that her use of the seemingly minimal palette of black paper and white wall becomes something far from simple when it confronts the viewer with as a wall-sized panorama of violent history and twisted human relationships. The complicated worlds of power, desire, identity, shame, and seduction conjured by her population of characters have seeded a new thread of discussion in the critical debate over race and artistic representation in America. In the introduction that he prepared for tonight, Hilton Alls writes that Walker has adopted, by 1994, a method of working that connected black paper to the black figure, and the ensuing flatness of interpretation that usually greets both remains a brilliant strategy. For in it, Walker became free to create around, or cut around, various mythologies concerning femaleness, blackness, and the rest. So doing, she found humor in the mundane, wild flights of wit in the ordinary, which is what racism generally robs black artists of, a sense of humor and how we are perceived. As the youngest grantee of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Award, and an artist with a long resume of solo exhibitions at major institutions throughout the world, Kara Walker has given us a lot to talk about in her, as of now, 10-year-old professional career. So let's get to it. Please welcome Philippe Vergne, who will further introduce Kara Walker.
Thank you. It's nice to be back for a few minutes. I guess you didn't know Hilton Alls was kind of white and speaking with a thick French accent. I'm gonna have to pass tonight, but maybe passing could be in the context, seen in the context of Kara Walker works. I decided that to introduce Kara, I would write her a letter, I would be part of a teenage fan club. And I would write to someone I think is important. Dear Kara, I was trying to remember. Don't make me laugh when I do my game, please. Dear Kara, I was trying to remember when was the first time I encountered your work. Thinking back, I believe it was in Paris in 1995, so about 10 years ago, which means that you didn't know it, but I've been stalking you for 10 years. The exhibition was called La Belle et la Bête, The Beauty and the Beast, which again, I think is kind of relevant in the context of your work. And I believe that, but memory might play tricks on me, we had few drinks before, that the work in the exhibition was called The Battle of Atlanta, being the narrative of a Negress in the flame of desire, a reconstitution. Then, in February 1997, when I came to the Walker, the first exhibition I encountered here, which was curated by Richard Flood and entitled No Place Like Home, included a cyclorama titled Slavery, Slavery, presenting a grand and lifelike panoramic journey into picturesque Southern slavery, or Life at Old Virginia Hall, sees a peculiar institution as never before, all cut from black paper by the able hand of Kara Elizabeth Walker, an emancipated Negress and leader in her cause. I was kind of baffled. Coming from a culture which still is in absolute denial to deal with its own colonial past, I thought that your work was pretty rad, rad because pretty, and pretty because rad. You get it. I was also thinking, wow, this woman is crazy. She's pushing all the buttons. She's gonna die. So first, I'm quite happy that you didn't, that you're still alive. I have to say that since the Battle of Atlanta, I never ceased to be fascinated by the way your work has embraced, on an epic scale, history, the underbelly of history, or, if I may put it this way, history from its rear end. By rear end, I mean here the American darker historical locations and the linear narrative that underlines the history of modernism. Looking at your silhouette, your mural, your drawings, and more recently your films that you can see right now in one of our gallery, one of the Walker gallery. Looking at your protagonist, licking, sucking, digging, poking, shitting, eventually copulating, or even worse, in often outrageous and voracious way, I cannot not think about antecedents such as Goya, Egon Schiele, Antonin Artaud, the American writer Steve Cannon, and the exquisite sophistication and highly disturbing words of Marquis de Sade. Under an aesthetic inherited from 19th century middle-class Southern ladies' art, flirting with kitsch and mass culture, you have aggressively expanded the debate on race and its representation. You have stretched it beyond the notion of good and evil, for our own pleasure. You have pushed your art to the very specific level of narrative cohesion, using seductive visual effects to comment with a twist on the history of race relations, slavery, and sexual exploitation. You have appropriated and twisted the code of constructed national memory that is American history. And do it in such a way that no one is left off the hook uninjured. You say a lot with a little information, which is the virtue and the vice of stereotypes. The problem is that no one can pretend that the stereotypes you use are no longer active in our world. We cannot pretend that we don't know what they mean and how they make us feel. We cannot ignore them. You do not let us forget that black bodies in pain in general, for public consumption, have been and still are a European, American delicatessen. We are not only talking here about basketball, boxing, or any kind of entertainment, but about Emmett Till, Rodney King, and Amadou Diallo. Cara, you have a talent to trigger our guilt at three levels. The guilt surrounding the history of slavery, the guilt surrounding the use and eventually the perpetration of stereotypes, and the guilt associated with a voyeuristic fascination with sexual and scatological function. You lure us into your work and your world by using the narrative authority of the novel, a 19th century cultural form born out of the need to reassess social status quo. But in the same breath, you debunk it morally. You debunked it, beyond morality, thanks to a vitriolic sense of humor. And you leave us alone, laughing ourselves to tears. Your work has been labeled visual terrorism, too sexist and derogative to be suitable for the audience's gaze and judgment. Well, it's right. It's visual terrorism. But in my opinion, this is one more reason to put it in the public eye. And you wrote once, you can please everyone, and why should you? The argument that my work is not acceptable by all is right, but what art work would actually does that? Cara, you have expatriated, relocated a century of modern history and art history, and have questioned an ideological aesthetic of pure form, as well as the universality of the modernist canon. You also wrote, my works are erotically explicit, shameless. I would be happy if visitors would stand in front of my work and feel a bit ashamed. Ashamed because they have simply believed in the project of modernism. Believe me, you can be happy. It's working. This month, the American justice system has reopened the Emmett Till case. This month, Minnesota remembers with pain the 1920s Duluth lynching. The reason your visual terrorism should be shoved in the public eye would be to attempt, with the help of your work, to reclaim a history that has never overcome the question of the color line. In one of your text work, you say, African, African't, Africouldn't, Afrishouldn't, Africould have, Africould. Strangely enough, I read it like that. American, American't, Americouldn't, America could have, America could better. Maybe it's too simple. Sorry, America could do better. Maybe it's too simple, but I think it's you to tell us. Please help me to welcome Kara Walker.
Thank you. Thank you, Philippe. In reply to your letter, have one correction so far, which is the title to the piece in Paris 10 years ago was The End of Uncle Tom and the grand allegorical tableau of Ava in Heaven. Each time I give a talk, there's a moment like this, a beginning, a once upon a time moment where I realize there are at least 100 sort of variations on the story of this postcard, which I tend to like to show first. Because the postcard, the image of a little black girl taken in the 19th century, was a gift, and as a gift, it began my reassessment of visual images and myself as a maker of visual images. I was about 20 or 21 when I got this card and was very earnestly trying to make paintings as an undergraduate at the Atlanta College of Art. And I was doing something in my early student work that I don't quite have a name for, although I think there are some words for it. I was trying very hard to align myself with a mode of art making that could only be called white and male. Large and bombastic oil paintings of a sort that I thought were desirable, and I didn't have a sort of a means of questioning. What I did question was the artwork that I grew up with to some extent. My father's a painter, and I spent a good deal of time in my childhood and teenage years going to various types of art exhibit, from local craft council shows to black art extravaganzas and like. And I thought, part of my upbringing, part of my ethos, I guess, my creed, was something about equality and balance, fairness and integration, and keeping a low profile and not making waves. And something about the work that I was encountering in black art shows seemed to allude to 2 or 3 other possibilities for how to make art, or who to make art for, or what the purposes or the uses of art making are. Anyway, I'm digressing from my little girl. The bottom of her postcard reads, "Some class, eh?" And it got me thinking about a couple of different levels of experience. There's the experience of because it's a photograph, you know, that there was a real entity, not just an object, a real person who, in some moment that we can only kind of imagine, was approached or apprehended or asked to pose, or was taken for some kind of a perfect object, a joke object. There's a mirror looking glass moment that I have with the image, of course, where I sort of fall into her space and find that my progress is impeded by another source. That would be the voice of white supremacy that locks her into the frame and ventriloquizes this message, "Some class, eh? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge." And then there's my experience of this card as a person who is interested in making images. My relationship as an artist is similar to the relationship of that photographer or that framer. So, is it fair to look at this card as an artwork? I'm going to move on. This is jumping forward a couple of years. This is a piece from the Drawing Center in 1994 called "Gone: An Historical Romance of a Civil War as it occurred between the dusky thighs of one young negress and her heart." And how I got to this piece from a little postcard is a little bit of a story in itself. I went to graduate school at the Rhode Island School of Design and studied painting and printmaking. And while I was there, I decided to reassess everything that I thought about painting, basically to undo painting, to not make paintings, and to try and do the opposite. And I created a mission for myself, which involved using the simplest tools to arrive at a world that resembled myself, basically play God and make a world over in my own image. And part of this project became so kind of large that it became very funny to me. It became a joke. Just say, well, everything's black, okay? Everything's a black girl. And everything that I look at, no matter what Donald Judd, everything becomes sort of a reference point as, sort of, where does it fit along the trajectory of black history, black art, making black girliness. And what I found myself gravitating to over and over again were portrait miniatures from the early American colonial era, early moment, the black arts movement in the sort of late 60s, the New Negro movement to some extent in the 20s and 30s, and minstrelsy and all of the sorts of attempts at defining and negating black voices that have come up over the years. And I set about this task of just making drawings. I would make 100 drawings at a time and just draw. And what I found lurking in my imagination was there was a lot of stuff I already knew that I didn't have words for. This is a later drawing called Tops Prepares a Puppet Show. Back when I received the postcard, some Class A, imagine with me sitting in the attic studio of my house, my parents' house, trying to understand what it is to make a painting, what it is to have the authority to tell an audience what to think or how to think it or how to see it or how to move through my world, and sort of discovering that there isn't really a coherent world that looks and feels like me in existence for that audience to move through. I got very interested sitting in the attic in romance novels, the effectiveness of romance novels, because they sat very much on the edge of fine literature, very much over the edge of anything that might be considered fine literature. And yet they still had a lot of cachet. There's still a big call for the sort of titillation and thrill that romance novels can provide. And I got to thinking about how amazing that is, how manipulative and amazing it is to be an author who can create a heroine whose adventures or misadventures don't necessarily have the reader's best interest at heart, at least as far as if that reader considers herself to be a moderately progressive, semi-feminist kind of black girl who reads in these generally white, generally well-endowed female heroes who reads her own absence in those stories. I also, at the time, sitting in my attic, got to thinking about the truth-telling mythology of the black woman in our culture, thinking of Harriet Jacobs and others who have written their narratives, and found that even in the telling of their truth, there's a kind of a negation, a kind of an attempt to sort of mollify to sort of downplay the horrors to some extent, or even contradictions of living life as a slave, or living life as a slave who makes a choice as far as who she consorts with and who she doesn't. I got very interested in the absences in the stories, and went up to graduate school, sort of fled north to Rhode Island to try and construct a story. And like the telling of the tale of the creation of my work, it's a very jumbled back and forth kind of a story. I don't know if you can focus up there for me. This is a piece from 1995 from the show in Paris called The End of Uncle Tom and the Grand Allegorical Tableau of Avon Heaven. This was probably the second or third of these large silhouette installations, and the silhouette came about in that northern moment in graduate school while I was drawing and while I was trying to construct a written, jumbled, cathartic sort of narrative that pulled elements out of my real life, real experiences, strange experiences, attempts at self-definition that were sort of thwarted by almost slapstick events. And I found myself not being able to make a final piece. I found myself in a state where I could make 100 drawings, I could write a lot of words that worked themselves around an idea of blackness and an idea of a sort of transgressive sexuality, and worked themselves around a definition of self, but they never arrived in that place. And as I recognized that all of these words were forming an almost indefinite thing, I recognized the black hole, and I saw the black hole in myself. I saw the black hole as a space that is, infinitely dense and violent and impenetrable and quiet. And I saw the silhouette in there. It hit almost like a cathartic thing, because in some ways it seemed perfectly obvious because of the miniature paintings and the early American portraits that I was looking at, and the grand sort of history paintings that interested me. It seemed very obvious to find a form that was very romantic and sort of responded to this question I had about middle classness, or the black middle class, and that spoke so succinctly about sort of racial profiling, making generalizations and about physiognomy and all these sciences. Everything sort of came back down to his profile. So that it didn't hit me right away is almost funny. But I think it had to come about as a result of thinking about painting, or thinking about undoing painting, because really, as I saw it in my studio, this cutting out shape from a piece of paper was an act of removal, finding something in a black space and pulling it out, as opposed to constructing something. This is also from the Grand Allegorical Tableau Van Heaven, and a working drawing for that piece. The sorts of images that come out as I sit down to do watercolors and drawings like this is a very small watercolor, 6 inches or so, have, even before I recognized the importance of the racial drama, say, in my work, the sort of psychosexual tension was always apparent. And for instance, in a drawing like this, I think part of it is sort of improvised, and part of it comes from a sort of a misinterpretation of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom character. Thinking about how the author, constructs her idealized black man who, to some extent, represents some side of herself, and is, eternal in all those ways that deny his masculinity and make him, a sort of a desirable entity, or desirable, palatable for her readership, and less than palatable, I guess, today. This was from the 1997 piece that was part of a show here at the Walker, which Philippe kindly remembered the title of, the Slavery, the shortened version. And I've been wanting for a couple of years leading up to this to make a cyclorama. I mean, when I started doing silhouettes and thinking about this black hole and removing an object from a space, I was also thinking, the romance and the femininity and the middle class voice, the polite voice, the small sort of second class art form that doesn't really sort of meet standards of high modernism. Coupled that with that grand, pompous, ego-driven large scale something that I guess I always admired, that I always want to align myself with. It's kind of a neat way for those worlds to collide and confront one another. And as you move around the piece, there are some references that are specific to other artworks, or loosely based on objects and icons that might be familiar to some. And then there are moments that are very deeply personal, coming from that sort of moment of recognizing myself in that objectified, that object of the little girl, the gal, the pickaninny, some class A. I kind of think, in some ways, if it were at all possible, this is the work that's made by that character that was created by white supremacy. And in other ways, something that I learn every day about working large scale with these very delicate materials is that the work does have a life of its own and a mind of its own from time to time. I stuck this in here. This was a little collage from graduate school, part of the working model of collecting ideas and images and notes and stories. This is from the piece Africant. I think what tends to happen when I construct a linear, at least structurally linear piece, is the narrative builds kind of from the inside out as opposed to from left to right or right to left, and sometimes stemming from a phrase or a kind of a basic seed, a basic kernel, sometimes several kernels that wind themselves together. And for instance, this having to do something to do with what we take out of Africa, or the idea of Africa. And they're always very general ideas, always very reduced to the palm tree and the grass skirt kind of Tarzan narrative, missionary narrative, the presence of bodies that hunger. Actually, I was reading something recently about sort of creation mythologies in parts of West Africa, and there was just this passage that had to do with the nature of evil, and it had a specific quote, but it was that that evil is goodness that hungers. I thought that was kind of fascinating. Goodness that's hungry, all-consuming. This is a large-ish gouache, almost a painting. I'm still calling it a drawing, a working drawing called Insurrection. And there's a few selections from a piece in Chicago, originally in Chicago. Over the years, it sounds like it's been such a long time, 10 years. Over the years, I've continued to make watercolors and drawings, and some of them have gotten a little bit more refined, I think, initially. And in the galleries, they actually have a selection of some very early ink drawings that sort of spilled out of me. The watercolors also spill out of me, and there's some repeated motifs that come up, having to do with middle passages. There's always sort of a confluence, confusion of realities and fictions, and facts taken out of history that I feel I've lived through, in some part of my body, and the sort of questions that arise from how do you know that? How do you know? How do you understand the past when you always have, it's always filtered through your present? This one color they have there, from ignorance to arrogance and back again. Can I focus, please? Thank you. So as we sort of jump around chronologically with drawings, a few pencil drawings I've thrown in here are from a show of only drawings, a gallery show a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. And can you focus? And generally still manage to, like, this image spill out of me in an almost unplanned fashion. I tend to become sort of material to work with in future larger installations or other sorts of pieces. I threw in this title from a piece in 1999 because I was kind of happy with the title, but it's just to give a little bit of an example that part of my practice in the studio involves writing, doing watercolors and sitting down at the typewriter and just letting things kind of fall out. And there's something very comforting about the sound of the typewriter and the rhythm of my breath and the voice and all of that. And so every now and then a title spills out and is useful to me. No mere words can adequately reflect the remorse this negress feels at having been cast into such a lowly state by her former masters. And so it is with a humble heart that she brings about their physical ruin and earthly demise. And I constructed that sentence for a piece which is almost invisible. I wanted the piece to be almost invisible. And it was intended to sort of respond to charges that my work was irresponsible to every African American or every person of color, maybe, who fought for equal rights. So let me go back for one moment, because even though the piece is almost invisible, and I didn't want the piece to be black on black, in fact it was only black on gray with some white, had at its heart a kind of joke at myself, because it isn't really like me to sort of bang my fist on the podium and say, well, this is what I believe, when in fact I kind of believe maybe you're right, but does that mean I can't say it? The swans in the center of the piece have little black-looking heads on them, with black paper heads on them, and it was meant as a kind of an allusion to the sort of undergraduate painting work that I made prior to really addressing my relationship to race and gender, or race in particular in my work, and history, and there are two camps fighting over their mystery. It's a very dark slide. I don't remember it being that dark ever. But in 2000, I introduced light into my work. And introducing light was a way of very, very, very slowly getting myself geared up to understanding film. The overhead projectors that I used, which are sort of scattered around the floor, I thought of as kind of good working models, as sentinels. They kind of sit and they project, and they don't really, they're not very artful. They also have a kind of a second-class status as conveyors of information and not much else. This is a work called Insurrection. Our tools were rudimentary, yet we pressed on. And what it is a sort of a triptych of cut paper images on the wall and projected backdrops, which when you walk around, you sort of throw your shadow and interrupt the flow of the piece and mess things up and become involved. This is also from that same exhibit. There's a few more details. Also, in 2001, I had a moment where I got very, very, very tired. And you have to understand, I've made a very sort of small selection of images today because I've done a lot of work in a sort of short period of time. A lot of installations, a lot of drawings, and there's been a lot of talk and demand and that kind of thing. And I sat down at home and thought, there are no more images. And so what I did for a period of time was that I sat down and decided to write. I wasn't going to write a book or anything. I just wanted to see if I could use language, which I feel very, I think it's kind of evident here. I'm cautious with words. I'm not really confident about language. So I wanted to kind of test myself to see if I could use words to construct anything, a sentence, a landscape, a scene. And the things that came out, they were never what I expected, but I was very happy with, to some extent. I just limited my practice to 3x5 index cards and thought, well, this is work that nobody can really see. Until about 5 months later, when I got tired of typing and decided I need to make images to go with the writing now, because I guess I'm a visual person. So some of the images that I did, I constructed in largely the same way. It was kind of a ritual of working on little panels and sitting down with a painting kit and tissue paper and cutting the tissue paper delicately. So this is about a 6-inch little painting. And each one got a title. This one's called The Invisible Beauty. And this one is Gettysburg Battlefield. This is John Brown, or Big Love. Preacher Offers Advice. Frederick Douglass Distracted, The Game Is On. It's Gettysburg Battlefield Part 2. It's Ancestor. This is Two Competing Suns and the Imposter. Familiar. That's the entrance to the Underground Railroad. And that group of little paintings were called American Primitives, and I just needed to make them, and with the understanding that I was trying to learn how to paint. And in the meantime, I did some more projection pieces. This is called Those Nice White Folks While They Lasted, says one gal to another. An ink drawing, No More Memory. This is from a large show that included the American Primitives, projection pieces, wall texts, drawings, and the like. Also from that show. It's sometimes a challenge to kind of go back to your own images and kind of give voice to them, because I think the work kind of creates it creates little fictions around itself that it caused me to sort of question, well, now do I articulate what the character that I've drawn is thinking, or do I articulate what I was thinking when I made it? And I feel that if I articulate what I was thinking, it kind of kills the work. But they're sort of weird, less than interesting formal things that I brought to these pencil drawings for the drawing show, which you just have to do with sort of keeping it very simple, using the least amount of, using the fewest materials to kind of arrive at a greater impact. Has something to do with always trying to be subtle. But when I made these colored pencil drawings, I had been thinking about the Bush administration, with this picture in particular. And with this watercolor, I had been thinking about my brother and a sort of amazing ability to both define himself as a kind of a man and then undermine his self-definition. And this colored, pencil drawing with construction, I suppose, had something to do with being good, being seen to be that way, and erasure. And this earlier coffee and ink drawing had to do with being a young Black artist. The title is Negro Youth Speaks. And there's a little sign on the cross that says RSVP. Can you focus this one? This is another one of these large gouache drawing painting constructions. Another battle scene. And let me just go back from it. What I wanted to do, and I think the time might be right, since 2003, I've been sort of thinking about what's the next step. What's the next step? It's very easy to kind of retreat, make drawings, retreat, do some writing, step up, cut out some paper, large paper constructions, small paper constructions. But I was reminded by a curator of the memory that I had promised to make a film about 6 years ago. And if I would do it, he would show it. So I thought, well, there's an opportunity, and it's not just for nothing. So I set about making a little, very small, very rudimentary film, which happened in about, I guess, a 2-week period in a very ad hoc, do-it-yourself manner, which seems to be my studio model. So if you don't mind, I'd like to show that to you. It is playing in the galleries, but we can look at it here, and then we can talk about it later. Okay. Are you on?
Okay.
Yes.
Does it? Oh, it works. You okay?
I'm fine, I think.
Me too. That's the art part.
Hmm?
That's the art part.
Yes, well, at least we match.
I think this film is one of the most brutal work that I've seen recently. And I mean, like, I like the absolute simplicity of it. I think for me, among its qualities, this incredible silence, which is like, surrounding you when you look at it, and also almost, at least for me, the impossibility to not have an opinion about it, but take like a stand, left or right, black and white. First time I saw it, I was really, for me, it was the absolute negative of Birth of a Nation, the film. So would you tell us a little more about how the film came out, and whether Birth of a Nation or this kind of cinema was one of the influences?
Well, I guess I was looking at a couple of different things. And, one of I always forget to mention when I talk about sort of romance novels and stuff like that. It was also about pornographic novels. There's Mandingo, which sort of skirts the line between trying to be literature and being sort of pornographic, and stories in that ilk, Beulah Land, and then just flat out, anonymous pornographic novels that use slavery, sexual slavery, and antebellum slavery and chattel slavery as their sort of mythology that sort of spurs on the action, and so that's always sort of been the sort of the soil, I guess, that the work feeds from, and this in particular. But formally, I guess I was looking at the films of Lotte Reiniger. He was a German silhouettist and filmmaker in the early film era, and the films of Oscar Micheaux, who, what little I've seen, it's been sort of reconstructed, really had do-it-yourself quality. Sometimes I can't remember the title of the film that I want to refer to, but I remember just kind of bursting out laughing, in spite of myself, because of there's this incredible amount of goodwill and sincerity going into a project that, is not allowed to fail. To some extent. So the money runs out, the film stock runs out, the actors leave, all kinds of events happen, and yet the film sort of presses on, and so the narrative becomes increasingly more sort of abstract and cobbled together, and creates a whole new sort of cinema experience in some ways. So I just needed his spirit to just do stuff in the studio. But the sort of narrative of the film, in some ways, when I watch it now, I think, well, it's sort of repeating the themes of the wall work, but just doing it with time and as you said, sound, or the lack of, and that's something I guess every film student understands, but I'm just getting the knack of is how you can sort of pace discomfort.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you didn't want to make waves. Didn't really work, huh? I like that.
you see me backing up against the wall. Yeah, it's a big thing somehow. I recently there isn't much of a very effective firewall between sort of private life and public life and in the world. So recently I did an interview in a sort of public forum and just talked various events in my life, and I got one of those calls from home, the call of concern, that kind of don't make waves phone call, like, be careful, watch out.
Low profile.
Low profile.
I was not really like referring the private public, but the show at the Drawing Center was in '94, and then like almost immediately it was kind of like fireworks and of visibility, and which is good. But it also came with also the counterpart, which is triggered by the work, which is people started to react also, like very positively on one hand and very negatively on the other hand. How did you? Were you ready for that, and how did it affect your work, and how did you deal with that?
Well, I was not well prepared for it. I think when I started making, one of the qualities of the work, when I knew that something was really happening sort of in me and was kind of creating reaction, was still in graduate school, I knew that I was not getting the kind of challenges that I needed from, sort of my peers and teachers, except maybe one or two. But, really I felt like, okay, there's, at some point this is going to, I really have the conversation that this work is kind of screaming out for. But I didn't quite imagine that it was going to take place, I never imagined it would take place in sort of a public sphere as it did. I didn't anticipate the kind of praise or the sort of level of it, and after that drawing center show, things really did take off in a way that was almost surreal. And if anything, I dealt with it by thinking, well, the backlash was late and it counterbalanced the praise. But there are certainly moments when I had wished that there was a real conversation. And
did the conversation ever happen? I mean, the controversy, do you want to go into that and say what was
sort of specify what is controversial, because I think there are a number of levels to it. I think the sort of the meat of what is called a controversy is the letter writing campaign that I guess Betty Saar and Bjarne Pindell and other artists of color sent to museums and curators and I guess collectors after I won the MacArthur Award. Saying they don't agree with the content of my work, that it's derogatory to women and blacks and should basically not be kind of supported in this way, and questioning why it is that a young man pulling out all of these nasties, they didn't use that term, gets praised yet again. And I think what I always had at the sort of heart of my work that always keeps it very, I said before, it keeps it sort of soiled, is that kind of cycle, the sort of awareness that, that's going to be hard for me to construct on the spot, but the awareness that the sort of role that I had already carved out for myself, even as a painter, not dealing with race or racism or derogatory images or stereotypes, even not doing that, I was already kind of constructing or had been constructed as that kind of, Sally Hemings sort of, the mistress, say mistress to the white art establishment. And I found that within that sort of mistress character, that sort of Negress character, that Tawny Vixen, there was a real, sort of, there were entities who that stereotype was based on, and I felt I had kind of lived enough of that experience to know the complexities of it. So, and I also felt like there was what's controversial in that is what was always controversial. But acknowledging it or speaking it or voicing that character, I had never seen, I'd never sort of seen an artwork that sort of took that position. I always saw work that, sort of made a very sort of black and white sort of world that was much easier to digest and kind of maintained status quo, I felt. So.
You think it was like a kind of a moralistic reaction?
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways it sort of highlighted kind of a conservatism in the construction of the African-American, the Afro-American construct, that, there was a certain, there was a place that we were destined to arrive at through sort of protest and struggle and through sort of working our own communal interests, and that place needed to be stable. It couldn't be destabilized. And I felt that sort of growing up in the middle of that construct, we could only sort of recognize its instability or acknowledge it.
I'm going to ask a few questions to Cara, and then we will open to the entire to the audience. Your work, you're willing to show something actually that would be for me, like that would be nice. You had a slide, the endless conundrum.
Yeah, sure.
Do you mind going there?
See if I can get there. These are just selections from a large series of drawings.
And this series of drawing, was it actually the answer, one of the answers to this question? Like, for example,
the ship?
Yeah, Ship of Fool. Was it one of Because the theory of doing, you like making your coffee was, that's the way you answer to this controversy.
Yes, that's true. The series of drawings that this group is from was done for two reasons. One was to kind of try and construct my answers to the controversy. The controversy. I want another name for it though, because I've done a lot of these panel discussions.
I think you have one in your in one of your drawing, which is like a campaign run by matrons, hatred matron or hating matrons.
Aging matrons? I don't know.
Is that good English?
That. This one, actually, I mean, this, most of the drawings were sort of directly, they were just in that same sort of cathartic mode. I had actually just had a baby and was sort of at home and sort of wrestling with, well, do I still have a career? And, well, I still have something to say, still something to answer. But this drawing had more to do with Steven Spielberg and Amistad.
Oh. Of course.
Kind of. Copycat.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's...
I mean, the reason why I go there is like, I mean, you talk during your presentation, but the way you've been relating to a very specific location of American history. And I have the feeling that this piece, which is downstairs, kind of show like a shift in your work that for me when I saw this piece, it was from this moment in American history open to another moment where modernism and the history of modernism almost along the line of the what happened around the primitivism. That one, sure. Thank you. We work together. At MoMA, raised like how to use, how African material was used and was its source material or work in general. And for me, this work like really opened a door, like a huge door, a fascinating door into your. Would you?
Well, what you were saying about the primitivism, the primitive show, this piece actually was kind of, well, I can't say it was directed, but there was a show, it was for a show at the Biale Museum in Switzerland, and the premise of the shows had to do with, it was called Ornament and Abstraction, and the curator had kind of, introduced me to the collection, which has a lot of classics of modernist, primitive, what do we want to call that now? The Picassos and the Braques and the primitivists, modernist, 20th century, early 20th century, primitive modernism, blah, blah. And then in between, we have this collection of African oceanic artifacts created by anonymous artisans to sort of highlight the mastery of those European masters, thank you. And I was asked to kind of create a piece that would respond to that, which seemed almost too easy. So, I got to thinking about other associations with, with the primitive, the sort of lust for the African, for the primitive spirit, for the thing that expressed some kind of lack, European lack. I'm not sure what that was, but Josephine Baker was sort of spoken about and touted as a kind of walking, dancing spirit of that era, that moment. She was the zeitgeist, and yet she's also a girl from Louisiana, St. Louis. And so I could have gone on a tangent with Josephine Baker and desire and colonialism and mastery and the capturing of primitive ideals, ideas, bodies for, to sort of further the aims of empire, and then sort of causing that. My intervention is just to kind of undermine it and show up the would-be masters. Sort of an overdose of primitive, to sort of overdo it and stuff too many bananas down throats.
And spices.
And spices.
You know that Le Corbusier was very famous because he was doing a drag show where he was impersonating Josephine Baker.
She was the hit, and that was actually the other. I don't know how much of this influence note-taking stuff is useful here, but when I was, I think I did a lot of sort of compiling of notes and ideas for this piece, and one of the things that seems, it's always been kind of present in the work anyways, sort of transgressing boundaries, sort of not defining things as clearly black and white passing, and not clearly male or female, or sort of not just about blurring lines, but really sort of creating sort of crinkly sort of bits of sort of rigid moments that slip. So I've got in my picture files and notes these stories, photo essays, let's say, pornographic photo essays from like black, huh?
I haven't seen that.
No, black, well, no, they're just in my, at home, in my studio, sort of transgender black characters and the sort of white, it's still the same white supremacist narrative that becomes her self-definition to some extent, well, the way I love those white boys, the way, they look at me this and this way, the way I surprise them with my such and such. And so that was kind of the overriding
of the piece.
Yeah.
It's like decorative. The decorative play an important role in your work. I mean, like, it's obvious when you, like, whether it's the murals or the watercolor, that it's all very, I mean, like, the visual impact is very strong. Do you use that as a lure to bring us to the work and then, like, hitting the audience on the face? Because there is this...
I never try to hit anybody on the face. I just keep avoiding. No, it is, I mean, it's true. No, it's I think when I started out to make this work, I wasn't thinking so much about beauty, but as it's grown, I mean, it's just it's been sort of recognizing the natural flow of my own hand, and the I don't know that I'm sort of aiming for beauty, but I do know that in order to create a space where people want to look, there has to be a kind of a seduction involved, and the means of seduction that I sort of have in my in my own sort of space have to do with a kind of look, a kind of sort of the delicate gesture, sort of just really very classical sorts of fingers and toes, and sort of paying attention to those details that they're very generalized in some way, but and yes, and I think part of being now in this black feminized space that I'm trying to create is then the snare, I guess. It's a snare that says, well, wait a minute, how do you know what black is? Where does that come from? Well, let's take a look.
Do you think your art is dangerous in some level? In terms of the transgression that it produces?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that art can. Art is, it's there and it's mute, and then it's what happens in between the viewer and the object viewed. And I don't know that, I can't. I can't really control what happens beyond that space. I wonder about that sometimes. I mean, artwork is always accused of being dangerous, but it's accused usually by politicians.
So you have to be careful. Don't trust them. You want to ask? Maybe we should open to the room. The light is very strong, and we.
Yes, it's been blinding.
We were here.
Yeah, well, that can be turned down because it's.
Yes, because it's kind of blinding. Closed. So we're going to take question in the room. If I see one here. It's hard to have a whole audience in mind. I think sometimes when I'm working, and if I'm very sort of in tune with the work, then I'm kind of, there's either a sort of a generalized ideal, looker, and it's a composite of. It's always a composite. I don't know. It's somebody who is sort of informed to an extent with sort of narratives of in a way, just with even the standard sort of 5 bits of black history that you learn in school. There was slavery, there was Reconstruction, there was a Civil War, there was a Civil Rights Movement, and there was, I guess there's this kind of question mark, like, what era are we in now? But I, from time to time, have had to make work in other countries, and places where I'm not entirely familiar with the way, the sort of, just the patina of, the racism, how it operates on people living in France or living in Germany. And because I've
still work with some generalizations. The works, you know, it has a kind of an impact, but I always feel like I'm missing out on some particular, you know, audience member.
It was you just did the project in Japan. How was it received?
Well, it was received very well, but I don't know what that means. Yeah, that's maybe my thing. I think the work there was taken to be, it was formal, it was well received formally. It's cut paper. It's kind of got beauty, but I had encountered those kinds of phrases that kind of make you wince. We don't have so many black people here, so we don't know what this means. We don't understand the particulars of this story, but I can see the general overall, and I don't know quite. And that's one of those lost in translation moments where I think, well, how could you not? In a way, I think we've exported enough.
Yes.
I look at Bill Traylor a fair amount, actually, as a show up at the Studio Museum in Harlem right now, which, I'd seen the work mostly in reproduction, so seeing a large group of the pieces of the work in person is really stunning. Yeah, and I'm actually kind of jealous.
Trailer?
Trailer with Traylor.
You want to mention, like, just for people who don't know who he was?
Oh.
Not you. He was, if memory serves,
American folk
he was a
untrained
self-taught artist and was working kind of a street artist, doing very kind of, I don't know if it's not naive, but folk art.
Yeah.
And actually there is some formal, I would say, I don't know if it's relationship, but connection with your work. I mean, the work is very flat. It's kind of an African-American Dubuffet.
Dubuffet?
I have my own.
Okay. That's taking it into the sort of mastery and the primitive and the mastery.
I have to protect myself.
But I think some of there's a kind of a mystery in his work that, and some of it might have to do with the titling, because I don't know who's sort of given the work titles over time, man and dog, or confusing event or something. But I'm amazed by the way he sort of images seem to spill out of him, and these kind of strange constructions that anchor figures to the cardboard or the curtain that he happened to be working on. He always considered the shape of the piece, and I don't know. I think those are really amazing pieces. That's.
I think it's interesting to work the way he has the moving figure anchoring or touching certain things. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of kinetic.
Yeah.
And like there's the things of a house, and every figure in the piece.
Right, everything is touching the house, everything's moving around the house.
And in a sense of positive negative space and where the edges. And I expect it to
Question?
It says in this write-up that you're on the faculty of Columbia, so you teach.
I teach in the fall.
So you have taught it.
Oh yes, I have. I teach. I've taught, I guess, 2-3 semesters.
Okay, my question is, I think that your short 10 years, you had a pretty amazing career. Given that you kind of decided coming out of Atlanta that you wanted to kind of change your style and along some different, create your own space, and then certainly that controversy, that you don't want to call it controversy, and then the popularity of your work, which is outstanding, giving you such a young artist and getting on the guard with it. So how do you kind of temper? Because it's an artist and not have all this. So a couple of questions. How do you temper your students' expectations that this is going to be as glorious for me? And number two, how do you take all these experiences that you've had in your short tenure, and how does that affect your teaching?
Well, I've been sort of reckoning with this for a while, because what I tend to do with my short tenures is I take all my experiences, I scrunch them into a little ball and stuff them in the back of my internal closet, which isn't always helpful for the students. I think where at Columbia, many of the grads have had sort of amazing successes in the short term, and I have tended to ask many of them, what's next, or what's your second act, or not even what's your second act, but what do you do to keep from falling over the edge, because that's always my worry. And it's not just, it's a worry because I feel like there's so many kind of models for black women in a way, and or I can't think of one right now. We'll camera somebody, to kind of live at large and then lose it. And I'm not going to go there. So, or at least the models that I seem to look toward. But on the other hand, when I'm working with the grad students, I try to just focus on their work. What does the work say? What does the work do? And how can you make it, how can you make it sort of operate on many fronts? Your internal, world and external set of, ideas, mythologies, or how do you make it connect? I don't know, in the long run, if I'll continue working that way. I've taught a drawing class, which I quite like, undergraduate drawing class, and there are places outside of New York and outside of Columbia where I can sense people being more receptive, because I don't really have any desire to, I don't think that it's very effective to come in as a star and get anything done, or I hope to get anything done.
Yep.
Were you ever able to have a direct dialogue with Basar, or were you before or after the letters?
No, we had a weird postcard writing thing for a couple weeks that didn't go anywhere. I think kind of contact. What's the only thing that I know has happened, and I just hear from, we sort of know people in common, so we've just never met. Betty Saar in particular. So, I think we each wind up having to kind of answer for the other in public settings, and I think she's tired of it. That's what I've heard. That's the grapevine. And I might be too. But.
Maybe I don't.
One or two of your slides showed clearly the use of overhead projectors in your projection pieces, and I wonder, as a device that won't associate school, and some of your images seem like they work in a kind of saying didactic mode. I wonder if that was an intentional choice to use overhead.
Yeah. It was very much about their just a sort of very basic, boring conveyor of information that and I think. My associations with the overhead projector, had to do with school, had to do with telling a kind of truth or fact and being very matter of fact. But I just wanted them to also bear witness in a way, just like to be these little objects that are always projecting and always looking at the same time. And so I kind of like them as that. I think the closest. Well, I could kind of. I feel like I can always talk on anything in a way, but since it's spiritual and art making, even though I tend to think that my making art is more of a curse than a blessing, I have been trying to work on my next piece. I've been banding around this idea of creation myths and just the idea of how it's always about how we construct ourselves. So that's kind of trying to make a larger worldview of how stuff is constructed with all its ramifications. What do I like most about being an artist?
Besides being here. Besides
being here right now. Well, sometimes, here's a funny thing. I live in New York now, and I go to my studio I take the subway, and I go to, a section just off the beaten path in more or less Midtown, and I love feeling like I have a real job. Well, I think my practice right now has always my practice has to do with my the confusion, say, or the contrast between having a social responsibility, to, say, other women artists, or other women, other black women, other women of color, and trying to sort of make work that's recognized or recognizable in those bodies, which answers another question, which was just asked, which is, the sort of audience that I have in the back of my mind when I'm working, and it tends to be a woman of color, a different sort of woman of color. But on the other hand, there is the individual, and there's just me and my sort of oddball ideas and my sort of tendency to want to try and make things that don't fit, and the sort of clumsy quality of trying to sort of make things right, make a big statement, and then sort of sticking my foot in my mouth or something like that. And it's when those two sort of worlds or possibilities collide that I'm most interested in, and that's, I guess, the most that I feel I can sort of bring to the big picture, the historical picture is trying to make that space sort of available for entry, that space where there's a social kind of mission, and there has been over a long period of time, and that my part in it is a little messed up. Yeah, well, actually, probably a lot, but Toni Morrison, obviously Beloved was a big deal in my thinking about this work. But or not just this work, but just my thinking about how you construct a story, how characters sort of consume both the writer and then become consumed by their own sort of demons or fantasies. Who else has been big? Jean or Jean Toomer wrote Kane in the 20s. That one for many years, or Invisible Man. There are all these kind of classics, but there are some that really continue to resonate, and I go back to them. There's there are moments surrounding the reading of work that are also very important to me. Somehow, like being in high school and reading Color Purple while I was supposed to be studying in my German class. Just those worlds colliding was very, very important. Or even reading Gone with the Wind. That was kind of big, largely because I had to kind of set aside my own prejudices against the book and read it and find that I actually loved the book. And as I loved it, I encountered all these kind of levels of, there would be a moment of absolute just reprehensible racism right in the middle of, my heroine's, narrative. So there's a good deal of literature floating around, and Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children.
I'm going to take one more question. Two more questions. One, you first, and then you.
I think it's funny thinking visually, because when I was saying that, I was thinking about this attic studio, and this book, this Black feminist anthology that I had been reading. It was sort of my first Black feminist anthology, and it was very much. And after that, reading bell hooks, and it was sort of, and Alice Walker's sort of womanist essay, and sort of there was this kind of identification, misidentification with the sort of feminist moment, feminist ideal, which Alice Walker and bell hooks, and I'm probably just misquoting everybody, but basically saying it was a white women's war, as far as work and equality were concerned, and that Black women had been kind of shunted. Given the short shrift within that argument for a period of time. So I think to some extent semi-feminist sort of qualifies. I think also it's my way of saying that I was a bad feminist as far as not being completely aware or respectful of my own sort of body or my own sort of place in the mainstream of the patriarchal day system.
Here.
I'm a dance student. I'm really intrigued by how the images of those
I don't know if I have a real answer, because well, I don't know, before I made this work, I mean, I always kind of worked figuratively, even if it wasn't really a human figure, and it was always about sort of channeling that love for wanting to just kind of move around, and I think in some ways my work is about the kind of denial of expression in some ways, and then it sort of resets itself, or reasserts itself. But the drawing that I do to make these works, and the drawing that's on the back of the paper piece, is very gestural and flowing, and I do sort of move around a lot because it's a body that I'm representing or representing. I have to kind of get into it and sort of understand the articulation of fingers and toes and how I want things to go. And sometimes I get it becomes excessive, over the top. And then cutting it out again is kind of a denial of all the activity that's gone in. There are moments when there's so much line work on the back of the paper that you wouldn't even be able to find the form. It's very hard to find the form.
In this context, I mean, like you did a performance at the fabric workshop.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Me to rewind.
No, that's okay.
Okay, the last one. Thank you. I'm weak.
I wanted to ask about your film because I've seen it in groups a couple of times. I wanted to see it, and I've never been able to really hear people. The reaction is always silence. What have you heard in reaction to your film that you're happy about, or just just what kind of gut reaction you had?
Well, it's I think the two reactions that are memorable. One was from a black woman who saw the piece, and we were in a club, so it was not like a real conversation at the time. But she, she was very concerned about the end. She was very concerned, and only because yes, it reinforced white supremacy in the end. It sort of reinforced a kind of sort of whiteness as the sort of fills the frame, even though it's sort of a grayness, and it's a dead thing. The other more sort of interesting, this came from a third source, but I thought it was interesting, and I didn't have a conversation with this artist about it, but I had heard that he said, he was very upset or just concerned that sodomy is always villainized, or is always sort of used as a sort of tool of a kind of a transgression that's bad, that's evil, and that he didn't like my sort of reinforcing that, and so that got me to thinking, well, is that really what is happening here or not? And I didn't really come up with an answer for it yet.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody.